Have you ever felt desolate and hopeless in the face of an endless struggle? Meet the story of Hannah, a woman whose pain and longing led her to deep despair. Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel, endured years of anguish and heartbreak over her inability to have children. Her journey is a powerful lesson in faith and perseverance. In this video, we'll delve into Hannah's story and how she found hope and comfort by trusting in God. You'll see how Hannah's heartfelt prayer and determination transformed her sorrow into a divine promise, resulting in one of the greatest prophets in the Bible. Follow this inspiring story and discover how faith and persistence can turn the deepest challenges into extraordinary victories. Get ready to connect with Hannah and find encouragement for your own battles. Once upon a time, in the ancient land of Israel, there was a woman named Hannah. She was married to a man named Elkanah. Elkanah was a God-fearing man, and even though many people followed their own ways at that time, he remained faithful to the Lord. However, life wasn't easy for Hannah. She lived in deep anguish because she couldn't have children. Hannah longed to be a mother. She dreamed of holding a baby in her arms, singing lullabies, watching a child grow, and teaching them about love and faith in God. But year after year, that dream didn't come true. Every month without a new life in her womb felt like a fresh stab in her heart. To make matters worse, Elkanah had another wife named Penin, who had many children. Penin was cruel and used every opportunity to provoke Hannah, mocking her for not being able to conceive. Imagine Hannah's pain as she watched Penin surrounded by her children while she remained childless, without her deepest wish fulfilled. Elkanah, despite his deep love for Hannah, couldn't fully understand her pain. He tried to comfort her, saying, "Hannah, why are you sad?"
Arrente better to you intention.
He loved her and gave her a special portion of food as a sign of his love. But Hannah wanted something that even Elkanah's love couldn't replace. She wanted to be a mother. Hannah's anguish wasn't just due to the absence of a child, but also because of Penin's constant provocations. The pain in her heart kept building up, and she felt increasingly desperate. Yet, Hannah never lost her faith in God. She believed that somehow, the Lord would hear her. One time, during the family's annual pilgrimage to the tabernacle in Shiloh, where they worshipped God, Hannah decided to do something different. With a heavy heart and full of sorrow, she went to the entrance of the tabernacle. There, she poured out her soul before God, crying her eyes out. She made a sacred vow to the Lord, promising that if he gave her a son, she would dedicate him to God's service for his entire life. As Hannah prayed fervently, the high priest Eli watched her. He noticed her lips moving but heard no sound. Thinking she was drunk, Eli rebuked her. But Hannah, with tears in her eyes, explained that she wasn't drunk. She was just a deeply troubled woman, pouring out her heart before God. Eli, realizing Hannah's sincerity and pain, blessed her and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah left with a lighter heart, having placed all her anguish in the Lord's hands. She believed that God had heard her. Time passed, and something incredible happened. God heard Hannah's prayer. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, whom she named Samuel, meaning asked of God. Hannah fulfilled her promise to the Lord, and when Samuel was still very young, took him to the tabernacle to be raised and serve God. So, Hannah's story isn't just about a woman who wanted to be a mother. It's a story of unshakable faith and perseverance. Even amid pain and taunting, Hannah trusted in God, and he honored her faith. Samuel grew to become one of Israel's greatest prophets, anointing the first kings of God's chosen people. And it all began with the fervent prayer of a faithful and determined woman. Let's dive deeper into the story of Hannah, a woman whose name holds special meaning. The name Hannah comes from Hebrew words that translate to grace, benevolence, or favor. These meanings are incredibly fitting, considering Hannah's life and faith. Grace is an unearned gift, something we can't achieve through our own efforts. And in many ways, Hannah embodied this grace. Even in her pain and anguish, she displayed a dignity and strength that went beyond human understanding. Her ability to endure suffering while maintaining her faith in God was truly extraordinary. Benevolence or kindness, was also a defining trait of Hannah. Despite Peninnah's constant taunts, Hannah didn't retaliate with hate or bitterness. Instead, she turned to God, seeking comfort and answers. Her kindness showed in her patience and her willingness to trust in God, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. And finally, favor. Hannah deeply believed she would find favor in God's eyes. Elkanah, Hannah's husband, had a family situation that was quite common in those days, but brought a lot of pain and conflict to their home. He was married to two women, Hannah and Peninnah. Though Elkanah loved Hannah deeply, his other wife Peninnah had an advantage that Hannah didn't: children. Peninnah had several sons and daughters, while Hannah remained unable to conceive. Peninnah used this advantage to constantly torment Hannah. Picture the scene: every time Peninnah gathered her children around, laughing and playing with them, Hannah felt more and more isolated and sad. Peninnah didn't just have children, she made sure to remind Hannah of her barrenness, mocking her and taunting her inability to conceive. This rivalry within Elkanah's household caused Hannah deep anguish. She felt humiliated and inadequate, and with every taunt from Peninnah, her pain grew. Elkanah, though he tried to comfort her, couldn't fully grasp the depth of her sorrow. He loved her and gave her a special portion of the sacrificial offerings, trying to show that she was his favorite. But for Hannah, Elkanah's love, while precious, couldn't replace her burning desire to be a mother. Elkanah's household was filled with tensions and rivalries. Peninnah, with her cruel and provoking behavior, and Hannah, with her broken heart and unfulfilled hopes, lived in an environment of constant emotional conflict. Hannah's pain was exacerbated not only by the absence of children but also by the constant presence of Peninnah's children, serving as a continual reminder of her own emptiness. Despite all this, Hannah never stopped believing in God. She didn't retaliate against Peninnah with bitterness or resentment. Instead, she turned to the Lord with her prayers and tears. She knew that only God could change her situation and give her the joy of being a mother. In this atmosphere of rivalry and anguish, Hannah found strength in her faith. Every provocation from Peninnah was another reason for her to seek God more fervently. And it is in this relentless pursuit and unwavering faith that we find the true essence of Hannah, a woman of grace, benevolence, and favor, determined to find peace and fulfillment in God despite all the adversities she faced in her own home. Hannah's story teaches us about perseverance and faith amidst difficulties. It shows us that even when life seems unfair and painful, there is always a path to hope and redemption. And that path for Hannah was in her deep trust in the Lord. Hannah was Elkanah's favorite wife. He loved her deeply, much more than Peninnah, his other wife. Whenever he could, Elkanah showed his affection for Hannah in various ways, like giving her the best portion of the sacrificial offerings. But despite Elkanah's love and care, there was a deep sadness in Hannah's heart that couldn't be consoled. Hannah was barren. She couldn't have children, which was a source of great pain and suffering for her. In a society where a woman's value was often linked to her ability to bear children, Hannah felt incomplete and ashamed. Each passing month without conceiving was a cruel reminder of her situation. Hannah's pain was so intense that she often cried and couldn't eat. Picture the scene: the family gathered for a meal, Elkanah, Peninnah, and Peninnah's children all talking and laughing, while Hannah, with tears in her eyes, quietly walked away from the table. Every time Peninnah flaunted her children or made snide comments, Hannah felt a stab in her heart. Elkanah, seeing his beloved wife's pain, tried to comfort her as best he could. He would say, "Hannah, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why is your heart sad?"
Arrêtez better to you dentenson.
Elkanah wanted Hannah to know that despite her barrenness, she was more precious to him than anything else. But what Elkanah couldn't fully understand was the depth of Hannah's longing to be a mother. Hannah felt a mix of emotions: love for her husband, sadness over her condition, and anguish over Peninnah's taunts. Her pain was constant and deep, like a shadow following her wherever she went. Even in moments of joy, this sadness was always present, whispering in her ear and reminding her of her barrenness. Despite all of this, Hannah didn't lose her faith. She continued to seek God, pouring out her heart before Him. In her prayers, Hannah expressed all her pain and hope, believing that the Lord could change her situation. She didn't know how or when, but she trusted that God had a plan for her. Hannah's story is a powerful reminder that even in the most challenging situations, faith can sustain us. Hannah's sadness and pain were real and intense, but her faith and hope in God were even stronger. And it was this faith that led her to one of the greatest blessings of her life. As we dive deeper into Hannah's journey, we see that her story is more than just about pain and suffering. It is a story of perseverance, love, and above all, unshakable faith. And this faith would be rewarded in a way she could never have imagined. Let's paint the scene with a bit more detail. It was one of those special times when Elkanah and his family made the annual trip to the tabernacle in Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices to the Lord. Shiloh was a sacred place where the tabernacle, God's dwelling on earth, was set up. Elkanah, being a devout man, faithfully brought his family for these moments of worship. During one of these visits, Hannah was more distressed than ever. Penin, with her children around her, never missed an opportunity to taunt Hannah, rubbing in her barrenness. Elkanah, while loving and attentive, couldn't fully grasp the depth of Hannah's pain. On that day, Hannah decided to do something different. She needed a moment alone with God. With a heavy heart and deep sadness, Hannah made her way to the tabernacle. Her steps were slow, each one carrying the weight of years of pain and humiliation. She entered and knelt in the Lord's presence. There, alone and in silence, Hannah poured out her soul in an intense and fervent prayer. Tears streaming down her face, Hannah prayed with a bitterness of soul. She spoke to God as if he were right there before her. "Lord Almighty," she began, "if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant." As Hannah knelt in the tabernacle in Shiloh, praying with fervent intensity, the high priest Eli watched her from a distance. Hannah's lips were moving in prayer, but her words were only a silent whisper. The depth of her pain was so great that she couldn't express it aloud. Seeing this, Eli initially thought that Hannah was drunk. It was rare to see someone praying like that, and he misinterpreted her behavior. Eli approached Hannah and, with a tone of reproach, said, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." Hannah, surprised and somewhat saddened by the accusation, quickly responded, "No, my lord. I am a woman deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer, I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman, I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Hearing Hannah's sincere and emotional words, Eli realized the mistake he had made. He saw the true pain in her eyes and understood that he was in the presence of a deeply afflicted woman, seeking God's comfort and intervention in her life. With newfound understanding and a compassionate heart, Eli said to Hannah, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." These words were a balm for Hannah's soul. She thanked Eli and got up, no longer wearing a sad expression. The priest's blessing gave her new hope, a renewed faith that God had heard her prayers. Hannah returned to her family with a lighter spirit and a heart full of anticipation. That blessing was a sign to her that her prayers had not been in vain, that God was listening to every one of her words. From that moment on, Hannah carried with her a renewed hope, believing that somehow, God would fulfill the deepest desire of her heart. Hannah's story teaches us about the importance of seeking God with sincerity and perseverance, even when misunderstood. Her unwavering faith and Eli's compassionate response show us that in the midst of our pain, there is always hope. Hannah reminds us that by pouring out our hearts to God, we can find comfort, understanding, and eventually the fulfillment of our deepest desires. After Hannah's intense and heartfelt prayer in the tabernacle, something began to change in her life. God, in his infinite mercy, heard every word poured out from Hannah's anguished heart. She returned home with Elkanah, carrying the blessing and renewed hope in her heart. Time passed, and just as Hannah had prayed with faith, she conceived a child. Imagine the immense joy she felt when she realized she was pregnant. Each day of her pregnancy was a testimony to God's goodness and faithfulness. Hannah, who once lived in deep sorrow, now had a sparkle in her eyes and a peace in her heart that everyone could see. Finally, the day arrived. Hannah gave birth to a son, and in gratitude to God, she named him Samuel, which means asked of God or heard by God. Every time she looked at little Samuel's face, she remembered her prayer and the promise she made to the Lord. But Hannah's story doesn't end with Samuel's birth. She had made a promise to God, and she was determined to keep it. As soon as Samuel was weaned, which in those days happened around the age of 3, Hannah prepared to fulfill her vow. She knew this was a difficult moment, but it was also an act of deep faith and gratitude. Hannah and Elkanah went up to Shiloh again, bringing Samuel with them. When they arrived at the tabernacle, Hannah found Eli, the high priest, and said, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." With those words, Hannah dedicated Samuel to the Lord's service. She knew he was destined for something greater, something sacred. Eli took Samuel under his wing and cared for him in the tabernacle, where he would grow up learning about God's ways in an environment devoted to worship and divine service. Giving Samuel to the Lord was an act of faith and fulfillment of a promise. Hannah returned home without her son, but her heart was full of peace and gratitude, knowing Samuel was in God's hands. And indeed, Samuel grew up to be one of Israel's greatest prophets, guiding God's people and anointing Israel's first kings, Saul and David. The story of Hannah and Samuel is a powerful testimony to what happens when we fully trust in God and keep our promises. It teaches us about the power of prayer, the importance of faith, and the blessing that comes from obedience and fulfilling our commitments to God. Samuel, the long-awaited and cherished son of Hannah, grew up in the tabernacle under the guidance of the high priest Eli. Even as a child, he showed a special dedication to the Lord's service, proving that God had indeed chosen him for a great mission. Samuel wasn't just an ordinary kid. Even at a young age, he began to hear God's voice. One night, as he was sleeping, he heard someone call his name. Thinking it was Eli, he ran to the priest. But Eli said he hadn't called the boy and told him to go back to sleep. This happened 3 times until Eli realized it was the Lord calling Samuel. Eli then instructed Samuel to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And so, Samuel began to hear God's messages, becoming a direct channel for divine words. As the years went by, Samuel grew in wisdom and grace before God and people. He became a respected prophet and judge in Israel, known for his justice and faithfulness to God. The people of Israel trusted Samuel, and he became a leader who guided the nation not only with words but with actions inspired by God's will. In one of the most crucial moments in Israel's history, God instructed Samuel to anoint the first king of Israel. The people had asked for a king to be like other nations, and God granted their request. Samuel found Saul, a young man with an impressive appearance from a humble family in the tribe of Benjamin. Samuel poured oil on Saul's head, anointing him as king and declaring that he was the chosen leader of Israel. Initially, Saul was a promising king, but his disobedience to God led to a troubled reign. God then instructed Samuel to anoint a new king. Samuel was sent to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, where he found David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, a simple shepherd. Though young and seemingly insignificant in the eyes of men, God saw David's heart. Samuel, following God's voice, anointed David as the future king of Israel. With this act, Samuel ensured that the royal lineage of Israel was established, a lineage that would lead to the birth of Jesus Christ many centuries later. Samuel continued to be a central figure in Israel until his death. He advised kings, prophesied about the nation's future, and kept the people focused on worshiping and obeying God. His life and service were crucial in transitioning Israel from a confederation of tribes to a unified monarchy. Samuel's story is a powerful reminder of what happens when someone is dedicated to God's service from childhood. Samuel listened to God's voice and followed it, leading with integrity and faith. He shows us that regardless of our origins or circumstances, we can be used in extraordinary ways to fulfill God's purposes. In summary, Samuel was not just a prophet or judge, he was an extraordinary man who shaped Israel's history, anointing its first kings and ensuring the nation remained under divine guidance. His legacy is a testament to the power of obedience and faith in God. After the wonderful blessing of Samuel's birth, Hannah's life continued to be marked by God's grace and favor. The joy she felt seeing her firstborn grow and serve the Lord in the tabernacle was just the beginning of the many blessings she would receive. Hannah, who once suffered greatly from her barrenness, saw her home filled with the laughter and activity of children. In His goodness, God granted Hannah 5 more children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Each new birth was a celebration of God's faithfulness and a constant reminder that He hears and answers sincere prayers. Hannah's children grew up in a home where faith was central. They heard the stories of how God answered their mother's prayers and learned to trust the Lord in the same way. Hannah and Elkanah raised their children in an environment of devotion and gratitude, teaching them God's ways and the importance of honoring the promises made to the Lord. Hannah's life, now full of children, was a far cry from those years of sadness and despair. She went from being a woman who wept in bitterness to a mother who sang with joy, thanking God for His goodness. Hannah was a living witness to the transformative power of prayer and faith. Each of Hannah's kids grew up knowing their mom was a woman of deep faith and devotion. They were raised with love and solid teachings, knowing their lives were answers to Hannah's fervent prayers. The boys and girls not only had each other's company but also the inspiring example of their older brother, Samuel, who served God faithfully. Elkanah and Hannah's home became a place of peace and joy, where God's presence was felt daily. Hannah, in her wisdom, didn't keep the story of her prayers and God's response to herself. She shared her experiences, not just with her children but with everyone around her, inspiring others to trust in the Lord no matter what. The story of Hannah and her children is a timeless lesson about God's faithfulness and the power of prayer. It's proof that even in the most desperate situations, God can turn sorrow into joy and barrenness into a family full of life and love. Hannah showed that with faith, patience, and devotion, God's blessings are not only possible but abundant and wonderful. Hannah's song, recorded in 1 Samuel 2, is a deep hymn of thanksgiving and praise to God. After the birth of her son Samuel and dedicating him to the Lord, Hannah exalts God's greatness and sovereignty with a heart overflowing with joy. She starts her song celebrating God's salvation and power, acknowledging that He is the solid and unshakable rock. She highlights divine justice, stating that God can flip situations around, lifting the humble and bringing down the proud. Hannah talks about how God changes people's fates, making the strong lose their strength and the hungry be satisfied. The song also contains a prophecy about the coming of an anointed king, a glimpse of the future Messiah. This prophecy is notable for anticipating the role of a future ruler, who later aligns with the story of Jesus Christ. Interestingly, Hannah's song has similarities with Mary's Magnificat in the New Testament, which also celebrates God's grace, power, and justice. Both songs reflect similar themes of worship and hope, demonstrating the continuity of God's message across generations. Hannah's song is a powerful hymn that not only celebrates God's intervention in her life, but also anticipates the coming of the Messiah and reaffirms God's sovereignty and faithfulness. If you want to learn about another Bible character, just click on the card on your screen right now. See you in the next video.